as you all know, because you all registered and turned in your questions, we're going to be discussing the Constitution, the political landscape that we find ourselves in, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. A couple of housekeeping notes. You have received a half sheet. You will see a list of news organizations, analysts, commentaries, some Substacks, and some organizations that are worth supporting. Please share that if you would like. Share it widely. We have more. Jerry has more in the back. And so please use that, share it widely. Next, there will be a Q&A session. Richard's going to give his remarks, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. We will only be taking questions on pink slips of paper, which Jenny will be handing out. If you sent a question in through your registration, I've already sent it over to the speaker. We've already put it into the speech, put it into the remarks. So hopefully, if you sent it in ahead of time, it's being addressed. If it is not, or if you have another question, please write it on the pink slip, and I'm going to put all of those together after remarks. We will have more question and answer time. Did I cover everything? This is being broadcast on YouTube, so we're not going to hand out the microphone because it gets really hard to hear. So if you do have a question, please write it down, and I will make sure that it gets addressed. Okay? Without further ado. Richard Primus is a former Rhodes Scholar, a former clerk for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and for his work on the relationship between history and constitutional interpretation, the co-recipient of the first ever Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies. He is also a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a senior editorial advisor of the Journal of American Constitutional History, and a member of the Board of Advisors of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to fighting threats to free and fair self-government. From 2011 to 2013, he served as a legal advisor to the Board of Regents of the University of Michigan, and from 2012 to 2014, he served as president of the Hebrew Day School of Ann Arbor. Possibly most importantly, though, he is also a proud alumnus of Young Judea, on whose National Mazkirut he served in 1987 to 1988, and he has been a member here of Beth Israel Congregation since 2001. Thank you so much.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Barb. It's weird to be up here without a Sefer Torah. If you were in Shul here on Shabbat morning, when Jerry announced this talk, he had sort of a colloquy with me live where he said, I think we're going to have a lecture, and I said, I've been told it's not going to be a lecture, I'm going to respond to questions. So you're all about to be victims of a bait and switch, because what happened was the questions that you all sent in were shared with me, and I realized looking at them that what made the most sense was to put the questions in an order where the answer to one would lead to the question in the next. And that means that I can just sort of talk at you continuously for a little while until I've answered the questions that you've sent in. And then we'll open the floor for other questions. But partly because I'm not going to talk at you for a bunch of minutes. And partly because I am an alumnus of Young Judea. Michael Apple, sitting in the back, was my madrich like 100 years ago. Partly because, right, of my Young Judea background. We are in Shul, and one of the things that I come to Shul to do is sing. And since I have the microphone, we're all going to sing for a minute before I start talking, okay? People like Mike taught me to do this. And here's what we're going to sing. We're going to sing a song that I learned at Camp Young Judea, Michigan, in Chelsea, right, here in Washington County, the summer I turned 9 years old. Many of you will know it, but I'm going to teach it to the rest of you in the way that I was taught to do at that camp. right? The song is Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor, which was, the text is from the Mishnah. The text is very old. The music was new in 1978. It's not new anymore. And we're going to sing it once, and then I'll be satisfied, and I'll start talking. I'm going to say the words. I'm going to sing the first line. You're going to sing it back to me. Right? The words are Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor, which means it is not upon you, it is not your responsibility to finish the work. Work here means project, right? It's not your responsibility to finish the project. Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor. And the second line is Velo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. Sources actually differ on whether the word is lihibatel or libatel, but the song is lihibatel, so we're going to do that. Lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. You are also not free. The usual translation is to abstain from it. I'm going to say you are also not free to sit it out. Right? And then the song adds words that are not from the Mishnah, which are Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash, to rebuild the temple, Bimhei Avi Yameinu, in our own days. So, the first line, I'm going to sing it once, you're going to sing it back to me. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. And then it repeats like this. Lo alecha ligmor. Those two lines together, all of us. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. Lo alecha ligmor. The next line, I'll sing it, you'll sing it back to me. Velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. Velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. Velo ata ben chorin. Velo ata ben chorin. And again the two lines. Velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. Velo ata ben chorin. Last part. Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash, Sheyibaneh. Sing back. Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash, Sheyibaneh. Same line again, so just repeat it. Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash, Sheyibaneh. Bimhei Yameinu, Sheyibaneh. Sing back. Again, Bimhei Yameinu Sheyibaneh, Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash. You sing it. There you go. Last part. Bimhei Yameinu Shey together. And then Bimhei Yameinu Sheyibaneh. Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash. Good. Right, that's a good use of the room. Here are some things about my perspective here tonight that I want to say by way of framing what I'm going to say. I'm going to two big important framing facts for understanding how I approached my assignment, right, when I was asked to come and talk about the new administration's executive orders and various other actions. And there are so many things going on, I will not be able to talk about all of them. Two frames, for this. The first is, in the last presidential election, this is a conservative show. Many to most people in the room probably identify as conservative Jews. In the last election, 3/4 of conservative Jews who voted for Kamala Harris. That's way more Harris-friendly than the country in general. It also means that 1/4 of conservative voters voted for Donald Trump. And I presume diversity of political view within our congregation, right, given the way this event was announced and so forth, my guess is that this room skews politically, but I presume a certain amount of political diversity of views. The second framing assumption is a much broader lens thing. It's about human nature, and it is that no system of government lasts forever. All governments fall. Right? That's the human condition. Right? Some governments transition peacefully, some transition in chaos, but no set of institutions lasts forever. Right? I have been saying from every microphone that has been handed to me for 9 years now that then Donald Trump, now President Trump, is a threat to the Republic. It has been a steady, constant view for 9 years. I believe it to be a correct view. And I want to explain exactly what I mean by that. He's not a threat to the existence of the United States as an independent country. Right? That's not what I mean by the Republic. The Republic is a way of organizing our business as a polity, how we do things. Right? There was a Roman Empire which succeeded the Roman Republic. Right? The French are on their fifth republic. Right? It's a way of doing things. The American Republic that I was born into had a bunch of characteristics that I will limn here, right, briefly. Electoral democracy, where there are free and open elections and high degrees of confidence, justifiably so, in the outcomes. Respect for political competition, meaning that the holders of office did not try to use their office to prevent people with other political views from running against them in elections by throwing them in jail or driving them out of the country, which is standard practice in many countries around the world. The rule of law, right, about which I could talk all night, but which means basically for our purposes, the idea that power and authority reside in offices and not in people. And that if you hold an office, you are constrained by the way the law builds and limits that office in what you can do, and you are not authorized to use the power of that office for some end that is personal to you. We have a system of checks and balances, which means both the thing that you learn in civics about 3 branches of government and so forth, but it also means a set of checks and balances that are outside that system. Civilian control of the military, separation within the executive branch between the political leadership and people who make enforcement and investigation decisions, civil society separation of powers, meaning important influential institutions like media and universities and other and religious institutions and other civil society institutions that are not controlled by the government. It means government in the public interest, right? People in government have lots of different views about what the public interest is, right? But there's a basic idea that one must at least pretend to be doing things because it is good for the public. Right? And then a set of substantive values, things like free speech and freedom of religion and private property and the presumption of innocence in criminal justice and so forth. Right? We can argue about what each of those things means. We can argue about what else should be on the list. But some cluster of stuff like that was definitive of the American Republic that I was born into and educated into. It was never a republic that lived up to all of those things perfectly. Right? No human institution ever does that. Right? But you don't grade governmental systems on the basis of whether they live up to ideals perfectly. Governments need to be graded on a curve. The question is, what is reasonable to expect given human nature and social organization? And as I look around the globe and over the sweep of human history, living under the American Republic into which I was born looks pretty good. Right? What I mean when I say that Trump is a threat to the Republic is not that I think that there's some serious possibility that the US Constitution, right, formally, is going to be repudiated and replaced with, some, other, draconian, autocratic constitution as a matter of formal law. I don't think is going to happen. The threat is that the formal constitution will remain, but the way we actually do things will have deteriorated so much from what I just described as the tenets of the Republic that the Constitution won't be worth the paper it's written on. There are lots of countries around the world that have wonderful written constitutions where you would not want to live, because how things actually work is way worse than that. That's the threat. What's my role with respect to all of this, besides just all of our roles as people who are alive now? I'm a professional scholar and a teacher. I am not by temperament an activist. I was pushed into being an activist in 2016 and thereafter on the theory that we had a situation that was a threat to the Republic and it's all hands on deck. And if you have a set of skills that can be useful, it is no time to be sitting things out. It's not what I am doing by temperament. And by temperament, what's super important to me in my capacity as a scholar and as a teacher and also just going through life is I am a huge believer in reasonable disagreement. It's one of the things that I try most of all to teach to my students. Success when I teach about controversial constitutional law issues to my students is usually not that I can change someone's mind. It's that a person at the end of the semester still holds the same idea that they used to about abortion or affirmative action or federalism or whatever it is, but they recognize that they're making choices and that people who have different views from theirs might not be crazy or stupid, right? And I believe in reasonable disagreement about lots of the most controversial issues that constitutional lawyers deal with. Abortion, affirmative action, lots of other things. I don't actually think that there is reasonable disagreement on the question of whether President Trump is a threat to the Republic and to the rule of law. I don't think there's reasonable disagreement on this topic. Empirically, there is widespread disagreement, right? And it's challenging, as someone who believes in reasonable disagreement, to look into the face of empirically widespread disagreement and have to conclude it's not reasonable. But it isn't. I think that there's also a lot of self-deception. But my own view is there isn't reasonable disagreement. And I'll sum up my thinking about why, and then try to talk about some specifics. One of my favorite things to tell my students is that the first rule of constitutional government is the same as the first rule of playground basketball. Right? The rule is no one can get bigger than the game. Right? Or stated differently, you have to be willing to take your losses. The playground basketball is a game of competition, right? You have two teams, they're each trying to win the game. But there's no higher enforcement official than the people who are playing the game, right? They have to call their own fouls. So if you play the game and you're not willing to have the other team call a foul on you and just shut up and take it and give them the ball, the game breaks down, right? The game can't go on if you're not willing to limit yourself and respect your opponent in the spirit of the game. Constitutional government is exactly like that. There's a tendency not to recognize that because there's a tendency to think of courts as the referees in constitutional government. That is wrong, or at least it's deeply misleading, right? The courts like to think of themselves as referees. Deep down they know they're not. We'll talk about that. Or at least not completely. But the problem is, The courts can only police the game of constitutional government to the extent that the other players allow them to. Right? In an organized game, if you go to a basketball game at Chrysler and the ref blows a whistle and the player says, forget you, there's no foul on me, the player's out of there. Right? And if the player does it twice, the player's lost his scholarship. Right? Like, that can be enforced. The courts don't have an army. Only the president does. Right? The courts can't raise any money. Only Congress can. Right? The courts can only do what the other players in the game are willing to do. And if the other players in the game were pushing all the boundaries all the time, the courts simply wouldn't have the institutional capacity even to call the fouls, let alone enforce them. The system only works because most players in the system, most of the time, the ones you like and the ones you don't like, have understood that they need to self-limit. Right? They can pursue their agendas, sometimes aggressively, but they can't just be breaking all the rules all the time, because then the other guy will also do it and the system falls apart. The playground basketball attitude is what exercisers of power have in a well-functioning constitutional government. Here's a different attitude that's not that attitude. It's the attitude that the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called the bad man attitude. Right? Holmes offered this thought experiment. He said, there are times when you must think of the law from the perspective of a bad man who wants to know only what concretely will happen to me if I do such and such. Right? The bad man's view of jaywalking is, no one's going to punish me for that. Right? That might be most of our view of jaywalking. The bad man also has that view about paying his taxes. If I'm not going to get audited, there's no reason for me to pay my taxes. Right? If I'm not going to get caught shoplifting, I'm just going to take it. Right? There are times in the practice of law when it is appropriate, even ethically required, for a lawyer to adopt the bad man perspective. Right? If your client is considering a course of action or has engaged in a course of action and asks you the question, what's my exposure? You have to, for a moment, put on the bad man perspective hat and say, this is what's likely to happen. Right? You should also have other conversations with your client, right, about reasons why not to engage in certain activity that are not just about concrete exposure and consequences. A system in which everyone had the bad man view of the law could not survive. Right? We couldn't pave the roads because we couldn't raise the revenue because people wouldn't pay their taxes. There are societies like that. Right? In the United States, historically, there's been a very high level of compliance. Most people pay most of their taxes. Right? Not perfectly. People cut corners. Most people pay most of their taxes. I can name a bunch of countries in which that is just not true. Right? But because it is, and it's not because we're going to get audited. They can't audit all of us. Right? It's because we have a sense of some obligation to the rules of the game. Right? Our attitude toward the law is not just that we only ask the question, what will happen to me? Although we do sometimes ask that question. We also ask that question, what does a reasonable person who's a member of our society have an obligation to do? Right? That's not the question the bad man asks. President Trump is a Holmesian bad man. The only way that he knows to engage with law is through the question, what will happen to me, concretely? If there are no consequences to me, and someone says, but sir, that's illegal, his only possible answer is, so what? Right? He's given that answer a bunch of times. Right? That's the answer he gave when told that there were mobs breaking into the Capitol building. Right? Here's the thing that's impossible, and not just, but this is how he's always been. Right? This is who he was as a real estate developer, that's who he is. Right? He's never changed because he's never had to. Here's what's totally impossible for me to imagine. president is sitting in a meeting, and he says, okay, and I want to do this and this and this. And someone pipes up and says, sir, I think that's illegal. And he says, oh, okay, I guess we can't do that then. Like, that's not happening. He is, I believe, the first person ever to occupy the office of the presidency about whom I say this. By which I don't mean that all previous occupants always scrupulously adhered to the law, right? Everyone cuts corners. But there's a difference between being someone who cuts corners in certain situations, someone who just simply cannot engage the perspective that says, I owe something like good faith compliance, rather than only the bad man perspective. But he's it, right? Like, he will use his office to enrich himself and his family personally in any way that's available to him. He drives diplomatic traffic to his hotels. He encourages foreign countries to enter into great big contracts with members of his family. So in the first Trump administration, there was a question about whether certain things that he was doing violated a clause of the Constitution called the Emoluments Clause, which is supposed to limit what officials can take. What I thought was the most astonishing thing was maybe not that the president was trying to take the money, but that his administration was defending his right to do so. Right? Like, he's not capable of shame. And someone who's not capable of shame, and I mean, it's been highly functional for him in a bunch of ways. But someone who's not capable of shame cannot play playground basketball. He uses power to harass his adversaries, which is not a thing you are supposed to do in a rule of law system. He doesn't respect the outcomes of elections, and he's willing to foster violence, right? That's January 6th, among other things. At this point, I sort of want to say QED. He's a threat to the Republic. Now, I want to be clear about something here. This doesn't mean that there are no arguments that I can imagine a rational person holding for supporting President Trump. I can. Right? I'll give you a couple of examples. And here, I'm distinguishing what supporters of President Trump actually say, which include lots of things that I do not think are reasonable, from a couple of things that I think are coherent arguments, right, that could lead a person to support the president. And I'm discounting arguments from things that I think are bad moral motives, like, I hate those people and that's why I support President Trump, like, beyond that. I actually think that a tremendous amount of support for President Trump, consciously and not consciously among a lot of his voters, is about gender role. But I'm not going to talk about that either. What's left? I think that's one of two that I'm going to give as examples. Take the abortion issue. I think that abortion is a subject of reasonable disagreement. I have views, but I recognize it as an area of possible reasonable disagreement. If you are someone who believes, sincerely, that the deliberate termination of a pregnancy is morally equivalent to homicide, then you have a reason to support President Trump, even if you accept everything that I've said about him until now. I'm not saying that you necessarily would, but you could, rationally. Right? You could say, I hear all of that, and stopping the mass slaughter of babies is simply more important. I also am aware that there are people in the Jewish American population for whom support for Israel seems like such a thing. People who think that the safety and survival of Israel is more important than any of that, and who also think that a Trump administration is safer for Israel. In my own view, separate conversation, right, take a long time. I'm not at all persuaded that in the foreseeable future that a Trump administration is the safer course for Israel. But I understand that people in good faith think that. And if someone thinks that and think that is more important than any of the other stuff I've said, I understand how that person could make a rational choice to support Donald Trump. But that person is kidding himself if he thinks he's not sacrificing the rule of law in the United States to do it. Right? I mean, that's what that decision is. Right? And the decision of which of those things is more important is a moral decision. Right? It's not something that I can offer you a logical proof on one way or the other. So at this point, I sort of want to say, if you came tonight to hear someone stand up here and tell you the situation's not so bad, you came to the wrong meeting. I'm not going to tell you that. Right? I'm not going to tell you to despair. Human history reports many things worse than this, and the survival of many things worse than this. Right? But the situation is quite bad. To put it into perspective a little bit, I want to answer one of the questions expressly that was asked in the questions that came in, which was, someone asked, what does it say about our political culture that we've elected Trump as president? Right? And I want to put the finest point on it that I can. What does it say about our political culture that a man who lost an election, lied about it, inspired and dispatched an angry mob to break things and threaten people in the hopes of staying in power despite losing the election, right? And then justify and lionize that action afterwards, could be elected again? What does it say about our political culture? And here's what I want to say is the answer to that question. It says we are just like everyone else. Right? I think in some ways that might make things better, in some ways it might make things worse. I was raised to think that America was special, different, so on and so forth. I'm very grateful to have grown up in America and to be an American and so on and so on and so forth, right? It's a pretty good shake, given the alternatives that are out there. But I think a lot of us had the view that we understand there are times in history, we understand there are countries in the world where something like that could happen, where something like that happens every year or so. We just didn't think it could happen to us. That was naive, right? Maybe arrogant, but definitely naive, because that's what it says about us. We're just like everybody else. We have to cope with it like everybody else. Okay. Beyond questions that I've already addressed, there are the questions that came in fall into sort of three categories, and I'll take them as such. One is a series of specific questions about constitutional issues that have risen above the fold, as we old people used to say, since Trump came into office. Then there's a set of questions about what people who don't like what's happening can do about it. And then there's a set of questions about Jews. About what does this mean for us as the American Jewish population in particular? And I'll handle them in those three categories. So the questions about specific constitutional issues, lots of them have the form, can he do that? Yeah. Right? And in analyzing any of the questions, the first important thing to remember is you're asking that question about a Holmesian bad man. Right? The mistake is to think that the answer to that question is the same as the answer to a question, what would a reasonable legal advisor tell the president he could or couldn't do? Or even, what would a court tell the president he could or couldn't do? That is not the same question, right? Or at least it's differentiable, right? Because in a game where you know you're not going to be stopped for doing a lot of things, if you're willing to do whatever you want, you can do lots of things that aren't, right, in the ideal sense, permissible, and that a previous holder of the office would not have done. So I'm going to mention just three. There are so many more, but these were the three that kept coming up in the question. One is birthright citizenship. One is about cuts in federal funding. And one is about the dismantling of agencies and this thing that constitutional lawyers call the unitary executive. And I'll take them in that order. First, right, about all three of them. These are things that are happening by what is called executive order, for the most part. What's an executive order? An executive order is a proclamation that a president issues, right, to the people who work in the administration, right? Executive orders do not make law for the world outside the executive branch. They affect the world outside the executive branch because they give instructions to the people who work in the executive branch. And if those instructions are stop funding that, right, then they affect that, right? If those instructions are do not recognize as citizens people born in the United States of parents who came to the United States unlawfully, right, then whenever such a person has to interact with the executive branch of the federal government, right, the instruction of the executive order says that person is regarded as not a citizen, right? That's what an executive order is. And part of the function of executive orders is practical, right, to tell all those people what to do and what not to do. President Trump has also, he's not the first person to do it, but he does it much more than anybody else. He uses executive orders for a second purpose also, which is the bully pulpit function. It used to be that executive orders would have a couple of lines of boilerplate preface, right, stating like, sort of like plain vanilla public interest goals that any president could have written that he was supporting. And then there would be some paragraphs of like dense, complicated technical instructions to the Secretary of Interior, to do X, Y, and Z. A Trump executive order often has a much larger intro, and it looks like a Truth Social post, right? It's a way of, do we all know what a Truth Social post is? I mean, it's a social media communication of the most unhinged Trumpian kind, right? It yells at people. It says, but it's not crazy, right? It's crazy like a fox. It's mad but northwest. It's the use of the medium to drive the national conversation and to shape people's expectations. Okay. The first one is birthright citizenship. What's the issue here? The issue here is that in 1868, after the Civil War, the Constitution was amended. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says all persons born and naturalized in the all persons born in the or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, except for, I'm compressing now, Native Americans not taxed, are citizens of the United States. Pre-Civil War, the U.S. Constitution didn't say anything about who is an American citizen. Silence. The citizenship definition that we've had ever since 1868 begins with, if you're born here, you're a citizen. There's an exception for the children of diplomats who are posted here, whether they're born at the embassy, which is technically not in the United States, or at the hospital, because we don't want to make them all be born at the embassy. The child of a tourist born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, right? That's the 14th Amendment. This administration is powerfully animated by opposition to immigration of various kinds, right? And a big part of its rise to power is on the promise to deport lots and lots of people who came here unlawfully, and maybe not only. And there is a phenomenon, right, relatively well known, of people coming to the United States without legal permission, and then being here for long enough that they have children, and the children are citizens. And there are people, right, with Trump's orientation who want to deport not just the parents, but also the kids, even if they could have grown up here and they're now in their 30s, right? The Trump administration issued an executive order saying the executive branch will not treat as a citizen someone who was born in the United States of non-citizen parents illegally present in the United States. Now, Con Law 101 tells us the president cannot change the Constitution by executive order, right? Can't do it, right? So on the merits, this is, I think, an easy question. The kids are citizens, right? What's going to happen, probably, is there will be some case where the executive branch refuses to treat as a citizen someone who is a birthright citizen in this situation. And that person will bring a suit in court, and it will be litigated. And when it is litigated, there will be people who are like certified smart law people who will make ridiculous arguments in favor of the Trump administration's position. I have seen some of them already. I regret to inform you that the most prominent one is written by two Jewish guys. They are, to the extent that one can say this, in a science or art like constitutional law, wrong. But the arguments will be made, right? And it will look to the lay public like, well, I mean, I thought the Constitution was clear, but there are people who say this and there are people who say this. I am relatively confident that the courts on this one will say, no, the kids are citizens. But I don't know for sure. I've been wrong before, right? What activists and entrepreneurs in politics and public opinion and also law do is they take ideas that are off the wall at time one and put them on the table, right? And most of the time, the ideas get laughed off the table, but sometimes they stick. Like totally crazy ideas like racial segregation is unconstitutional are off the wall at time one, and then someone puts them on the table, and it's hard to predict, right, where it goes. In the short term, I think the courts will say that the kids are citizens, but I don't know. And I do know that between now and then, a lot of people are going to be very worried, right? And the worry is part of the point. That is to say, if you told the president, you will lose this in court, he would say, do it anyway, right? I want to put fear into these people. That's birthright citizenship. Funding cuts. There are multiple kinds. One that I've heard discussed, like it's, as we say in this room, Kiddush Hashem. One that I've heard discussed a bunch in this room is about funding for refugees. The federal government provides a lot of money for refugee resettlement, not exactly a priority of this administration. And then there are other kinds of fundings, like the funding that is provided for universities, right? The economy of this town is dependent on the economy of the University of Michigan. And the economy of the University of Michigan, like the economy of all major American research universities, is substantially fed, right, by federal dollars in the form of scientific research grants, in the form of student loans, right, in the form of a bunch of other things. And the administration is cutting or going after or threatening a lot of this. You probably know, yesterday, the day before, it was announced that they're holding back $400 million in scientific research funds from Columbia University. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And the questions are things like, the can he do that questions are things like, can the administration just cancel this funding at will? Can the money be restored if the courts order it? And the answer is, well, there's some of this and there's some of that, and in the best case scenario, it's imperfect. So there's a law called the Impoundment Control Act, which was passed by Congress in the 1970s. There was a lot of good law made in the 1970s about limiting and checking the executive branch because there was Watergate. And when Watergate was done, there was like reasonably broad bipartisan agreement that like we should do some things to try to stop that. And one of the things that was done was the passage of this law called the Impoundment Control Act, which says when Congress appropriates money for some purpose, the president does not have the discretion to not spend the money because he doesn't want to spend it, right? Congress, the Constitution says that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, right? But Alyssa Slotkin does not come to my house and ask for the check, right? Like, it's not practical. That's not how it works. There's an agency that does that, right? And that agency answers to the president, right? So if that agency answers totally to the president, yeah, we're not going to spend that money, right? Congress can't spend it on its own. Congress hands the money off to somebody else to be spent. The Impoundment Control Act says you can't just not spend the money because you disagree with the law that says the money has to be spent. It gets tricky because there's money that's appropriated and not spent, or not spent in the near term all the time. Why? Because the federal government is big and complicated, right? And the administration can't, even if it's trying to comply, can't do everything at once. It has to make choices about what it's doing today, what it's doing tomorrow, and what it's putting off, and what it might never get to. So, but those sorts of decisions about prioritization and delay and so on and so forth, the Impoundment Control Act doesn't touch. But you can't just say, no, we're not spending that. Right? There is sometimes a funding statute delegates discretion to the executive branch. Right? It says usually these statutes aren't written to authorize the president. They're usually written as delegations of authority to, let's say, the Secretary of Education or the head of some bureau or agency or so on. There shall be appropriated for the use of, right, agency X, to be spent on the following criteria at the discretion and instruction of the secretary, right? This much money. And sometimes those delegations and conditions authorize the administration official in charge not to spend money, right? Or to say, to spend money if they are satisfied that the recipient meets the following conditions. And they are responsible to monitor that they're meeting those conditions, and if the conditions aren't met, to stop spending the money. Right? That happens. Where that happens, the executive has legal discretion to stop spending the money if the conditions aren't being met. Right? The problem in the case of the bad man administration, right, in the Holmesian sense, is if they say the criteria aren't being met, they just stop sending the money. Right? And it takes, and even if you can go to court, if you try to go to court and say, no, they're wrong, right? The criteria are being met, we're entitled to the funding, it will, even if it's hard to do, courts are usually deferential to the agencies. Courts are deferential usually to decision makers who do complicated things because courts are generalists. Right? But even if you can convince a court that the money is something you're still entitled to, it takes a while, right? It takes lawyers, and it takes time, and it's possible that you'll get some or even most of that money back, but in the meantime, you won't have had it. And if you're trying to fund most things, and a big stream of funding is cut off even temporarily, where temporarily is reckoned in weeks or months, or like ask someone who runs a small business what that does. That's about funding cuts. And some of the funding cuts, like the Columbia cut, what is being cut is partly driven by policy, and it's partly driven by the need to project power and the desire for revenge. Right? One important difference between Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0 is that Trump 2.0 is substantially motivated by revenge to a greater degree than Trump 1.0 was. The Trump 2.0 understands that there are institutions of civil society that act as checks on abusive governance, right? That include, and that do not think highly often of the Trump administration, and that are vehicles for causing people to have information and ideas, right, that are not friendly to the Trump administration. Right? The leading examples are media institutions, universities, and lawyers. And the Trump administration is targeting exactly those. Right? The defunding of Columbia is intended to send a message to every major research university. This will happen to you tomorrow. I'll talk about the anti-Semitism angle at Columbia for a moment, a bit later. No, I'll say it right now. I will say, officially, the federal government, the executive branch, withdrew $400 million of grants from Columbia because Columbia was insufficiently protecting Jewish students against anti-Semitism. This is garbage. I'm not denying that there's anti-Semitism at Columbia. There's anti-Semitism in lots of places. This administration doesn't care about anti-Semitism as a general matter. There are within the senior ranks of the administration, the word is shanda, unfortunately, like some number of Jews in relatively high positions, and I think they care. But the administration as a general matter does not care about anti-Semitism. They have a guy who hangs out with Nazis and gives Nazi salutes, like in charge of running the executive branch. They don't care about that. But withdrawing $400 million from Columbia and saying it's because you didn't sufficiently protect against anti-Semitism is quite an excellent way both to try to cripple the universities and blame the Jews. Because who is it that Columbia and everyone who's dependent on Columbia is going to get angry at? I'm quite sure this occurred to the people who decided how they were going to frame this move. In a hopeful note, something really good happened this afternoon. The administration is targeting also like some major law firms that have done some really good work in the past, checking government abuses. The first one was Covington and Burling, the waspiest pillar of the establishment law firm Washington, D.C. has ever known, right? Like generations of secretaries of state, right, come through. They represented Jack Smith, the special counsel, right, who was prosecuting Donald Trump. And so the Trump administration has announced that they're revoking the security clearances of everyone who works for Covington and Burling, which is like, they're a big insider DC law firm. They work on a lot of cases where you need security clearance to work. This hurts them badly, right? And then after that, they announced they were revoking, at a different law firm, a place called Perkins Coie, they were revoking all the security clearances and also closing all federal buildings to their employees. Imagine being a DC law firm and you can't send your lawyers into a federal administration building. Right? It's like, and the message is very clear. Why? Because Perkins Coie were the lawyers for Hillary Clinton. Right? They say so. The executive order says that's why. Right? The good news is, the worry was, the intimidation is actually pretty powerful. Like, when a lawyer needs a lawyer, who does the lawyer go to? And the answer is, it's going to be someone else who the administration has the same sorts of tools to intimidate, right? And there were worries, like is anyone going to stand up? So the good news, as I heard this afternoon, and I could not have scripted this part of it better if I were hoping for a best case scenario, is that the representation of Perkins Coie has been taken on by a DC law firm called Williams and Connolly. Some of you will know what this means. Williams and Connolly are the gunslingers of Beltway litigation. Like, they are the law firm of last resort. In my youth, there was a television show called The A-Team, and the tagline was like, if you're in trouble, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team. Williams and Connolly's lawyer's entrance into a room in DC is considered a hostile act. Like, everyone scurries behind the tables. I almost worked there once. They are like amazing lawyers, and the only thing they care about is winning. And I thought if there was somebody who I was going to hope would step forward, and they have Democratic lawyers, they have Republican lawyers, right? Their self-conception is, we take the cases that nobody else can possibly take and win, and damn it, we're going to win them. And we don't care who it's for, right? It's actually useful in civil society. I mean, they're pathological, right? But it's useful in civil society to have some institutions that are like that, and I'm very happy that they've taken on this representation. I wish them luck. Okay. The last of the three categories is about agencies in the universe and the unitary executive. This is a very big deal, and it's again a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Because the Republican Party of Donald Trump is not the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan in a whole bunch of ways. One of them is the Republican Party of Trump 1 was not actually a party of small government. Right? The Republican Party of Trump 1 was a party that actually wanted to do lots of things, right? For which you need a government. Something happened. The thing that happened was there's a long-standing slice of the Republican Party, a libertarian slice, that has had a dream of gutting the federal administrative state, right, for decades and decades and decades. What do I mean by this? Modern government doesn't get stuff done by legislatures and presidents, right? Because the world is much too big and too complicated. Modern government gets stuff done through agencies, right? You hire thousands of people to run the national parks. You hire thousands of people to revise the tax code and collect the taxes. You hire thousands and thousands of people to keep the highways running, right? All of the things that you hire thousands and thousands of people to process the social security checks, right? To do the health and safety inspections, right? Those are the agencies. They're the things that actually do governance, right? And the first Trump administration tried to work through a bunch of them, tried to control a bunch of them, and so on and so forth, but it wasn't committed to destroying them. In 2018, one of the things that I was going around saying was, look, at least Trump, for all of his downsides, is relatively ineffective. Right? He doesn't seem to really understand what he can and can't get done. And there are enough people doing enough things, putting up roadblocks around him, that he doesn't seem to be able to call the shots all that well, even within the White House. Right? His malevolence is limited by his incompetence. Right? But it was also clear at the time that one of the deep problems with the Trump administration was it was proof of concept. It was proof that you can be a Holmesian bad man and win the presidency, which we before hadn't thought, right? I remember a debate in a Republican Party primary debate in the 2016 campaign where Jeb Bush looked across the stage at Donald Trump and said, "You cannot bully your way to the presidency of the United States." And Jeb Bush was expressing the playground basketball rule, right? That everyone thought, right, that's right. You can bully your way to a lot of things in life, but not to that. Trump proved this was false. And once it's shown to be false, every other billionaire bully says, why not me? Right? The question is, who will be president after Trump with the same playbook and will be more effective? And one guy figured out he doesn't have to wait until after Trump. He can be president now. Right? And he has an agenda to destroy the agencies. Right? He has an agenda to destroy the agencies because the federal government is one of the only things in the world that can slow him down. Right? It's the only. He doesn't want anything to be able to slow him down. Right? He wants to be able to do what he wants. And the less there is a federal government, the more he can have that. Right? Married to a long-standing ideology that has been part of the Republican Party for a long time about gutting the agencies, we get what we have now, which is DOGE, right, the Department of Government Efficiency, which so far has laid off more than 60,000 federal employees. I personally know, you probably personally know, some number of people who have lost their jobs and are looking for other things. There will be more. The economic impacts will be, I don't know what exactly. Here's the really important constitutional law background thing that's going on in the background. The question is, how much authority does the president have over all of these agencies? And the traditional answer legally is, well, it depends. There are some agencies where the president has at-will authority. There are some agencies where the president appoints the leadership, but like the SEC, the FCC, and so on and so forth. But there's a board of commissioners, and each president only appoints a couple of them, right? And the board at any given time is a coalition of people appointed by the last few presidents. And once they're in place, they can't be removed except for misbehavior. They can't just be fired by the president. That's a check on the president's ability just to direct the administrative state to do whatever he wants. And it's a super important check, right? Without that check, I'm not sure that Congress, over the years, would have constructed the agencies that it has constructed, right? Because it's a way of creating a lot of power in the executive branch and then creating some security against abusing it, right? Early in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, right, an administration which created lots of agencies, right, to pull the United States out of a depression, the Supreme Court decided a very important and little-known case, like outside the world of administrative law nerds and lawyers, called Humphrey's Executor. Humphrey's Executor was a case in which Franklin Roosevelt tried to fire a postmaster. And the claim brought on behalf of the postmaster was, you can't, I have protection against this. And the president said, no, I think I can fire you. And the court said, Mr. President, you can't fire me. And that case has been the basis for a lot of law that's been passed since then to insulate, to some degree, administrative agencies from direct presidential control. There's some control, right, but not at-will control. There has been a legal movement since the 1980s to overrule Humphrey's Executor and give the president direct control over it and every other thing that is in some way part of the executive branch. The movement goes by the name the Unitary Executive Movement. Their theory is the Unitary Executive Theory. The guiding idea is this branch of government is only one person big. Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the article about the presidency, begins, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That's section 1 of Article 2. And the unitary executive people say, that's it. Right? That means all the executive power is vested in the President of the United States of America, and no one else has any. And all other executive power that is exercised by the federal government is the delegated power of the president, and the president has the authority to control it. So the president can delegate, that authority can be exercised by the president's delegates, but the president has to be able to control them, fire them, so on and so forth, because he is the whole executive power is vested in him. Justice Scalia, in a very, 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 very famous opinion at the end of the 1980s, struck the first big blow, right, for this theory in arguing that an independent counsel set up to investigate criminal wrongdoing in the executive branch could not be insulated from being fired by the president and the attorney general, right? Exactly the opposite of the Watergate lesson. One important thing to know about the Scalia opinion that launched this movement is it was a sole dissent. He lost the case 7-1 with one justice recused, right? It was a fringe theory. But that was 40 years ago, and ideas moved from off the wall to on the table. And there are today somewhere between 2 and 6 votes on the Supreme Court for some form of unitary executive theory. The theory is wrong. Section 1 of Article 2 doesn't say all the executive power is vested in the President of the United States, and it's quite obvious that it isn't, for lots of reasons, including that there's some executive power that's obviously vested by the Constitution elsewhere. We don't usually think about it this way because our civics teachers taught us to think about it all wrong, but the House of Representatives has the power of impeachment. That's not legislation. That doesn't make a law. That's a prosecutorial action. It's an executive power. It's not vested in the president, right? There are a bunch of other examples, right? In 1787-88, the people who didn't want to vote to ratify the Constitution brought as one of their leading criticisms, this Constitution vests executive power all over the place. Not just in the people who were pro-Constitution, yes, it does, and that's a good thing, right? The theory is wrong. The fact that I will stand up here and tell you that the theory is wrong, I mean, you don't have to believe me. There are many smart people, some of them confirmed by the United States Senate, who will say, no, Primus is wrong. The unitary executive theory is right. I think it's wrong. What I know is there are 2 to 6 votes on the Supreme Court for it. So what's going to happen is that at some point in the president's effort to exert control over and dismantle agencies, he will fire someone who the law says he can't fire. And that person or someone affected by the firing will bring suit and say, I can't be fired, and point to the law and point to the decision in Humphrey's executor, say, the president can't do this, and it will be litigated, and it will go to the US Supreme Court. The first one won't go to the US Supreme Court, but they'll keep coming, and one of them will go to the US Supreme Court. And I genuinely don't know what the outcome of that case is going to be. It would not surprise me if they overrule Humphrey's executor and say, the president can fire these people. It would surprise me if they say there are 0 executive officers within the government who the president can just fire at will, because I cannot count to 5 on the Supreme Court for the proposition that the president should be able to fire the commissioners of the Federal Reserve. Right? A president who can fire the commissioners of the Federal Reserve can adjust monetary policy, right, including ahead of elections, to grease the economy, right, and say that is super dangerous. I don't think there are 0 votes on the Supreme Court for the proposition that he can fire even the Federal Reserve, but I can't get to 5. They will say some weird, intellectually indefensible thing in the middle. He can fire this one, they can fire lots of them, they can't fire all of them, it will be uncertain. He will exercise a bunch of this authority. So we're now talking about the courts, right? And what the courts can do. One of you asked a question about the influence of mega-rich conservative donors on the court. Here I want to say don't worry about it. I spend no time losing sleep over this. It is ridiculously corrupt that justices accept things from rich donors and so on and so forth. They shouldn't do that. But nobody should worry that it changes how the justices rule. I see no indication of that whatsoever. I think that the justices are simply getting paid to do what they would have done anyway by people who want to hobnob with the justices. I don't think that's a problem. The problem is, what will the courts do and what will Trump do in response to what the courts do? Sometimes the courts will issue orders. Right? The question was asked every time, will Trump defy court orders? And the answer is, he might. Right? First, he'll try to avoid the situation. He'll try to avoid the situation by closing down the thing that was objected to and opening up a thing that's a lot like it. He'll try to avoid it by intimidating judges, right, which he's already doing. Right? The U.S. Marshal Service is stepping up its physical protection of judges. But he won't be able to avoid it forever. There will be cases in which the courts rule against him, and I think there will even be cases eventually, depending on what he does, in which the Supreme Court rules against him, because I have thought poorly of the Supreme Court of the United States for a very, very long time. But I don't think so poorly of them as to think that they're all in the tank. And I think that even among the justices with whom I disagree about lots of very important things, there are a couple who I am pretty sure understand who Trump is and don't want to go down in history as the people who let him just walk through. Right? This is my understanding of Chief Justice Roberts. This is my understanding of Justice Barrett. I don't know that I can count higher than that, but I don't know that I can't count higher than that. I'd have to have longer disquisitions to think about the ways in which I can count higher than that or not, but I can get at least that far. And that's a majority of the court if the 3 Democratic appointees are there also, right? So I do think that there will be points, and the courts have tried, the Supreme Court has tried very hard not to get in his way. I think there may come points where they will say, no, here we have to draw some sort of line. And the question is, will Trump defy orders? And I think he's totally capable of that, right? Certainly he's capable of defying orders while saying he isn't, because then the public will be confused, right, about who to believe. Someone asked, if he defies the court orders, will that turn Republicans against him? My first and largest answer to this is no. Dispatching a violent mob to the Capitol had that effect for about 36 hours, right? The second answer, which is a little bit more nuanced, is yes, a few, some, right? Most of the powerful Republicans that would turn against him at that point have already been driven out of the party, right? The Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Justin Amash folks. But even if some turn against him, we're not going to get to 2/3 of the Senate to remove him through impeachment. That's basically impossible to imagine. And if he has a bad man view of the law, in the Holmesian sense, what does it matter if less than that turns against him? He's still the president, right? He's still going to go forward. So the real question is not whether it turns those people outside against him, it's whether it might turn people inside the executive branch against him and make it harder for him to get things done that way. And it might. It's like less likely to than in Trump 1.0, because 1.0 was staffed with more people who, I mean, I don't like the people who staffed 1.0 for the most part. But it can always get worse. And, you know, that's what happens, right, over time. The courts can do some. The courts can slow things down. The courts can prevent some kinds of problems. But courts know the limit of what they can do. In the 1950s, in one of the most important cases in which the Supreme Court ever said no to a president, to President Truman during the Korean War, the great Justice Robert Jackson, chief prosecutor for the Allied nations at the Nuremberg's War Crimes Tribunal, wrote, "We today are saying no to the president, and we need to. I have no illusions that we could actually stand in the way of a president who is determined to become a dictator. I'm glad that our president doesn't want to do that." Right? If we ever did have a president who wanted that, this court could not stop it. Only a mobilized electorate can do that. Right? The courts could have stopped it. They could have stopped it when they were asked whether he was disqualified for insurrection. The Senate could have stopped it 4 years ago by convicting him after January 6th, right? We were within 10 senators of not being here. But they thought it would go away, and here we are. So what other guardrails are there people wanted to note? One formulation of the question was, what guardrails are there to prevent more damage before the midterms? And I looked at this question and thought, why the midterms? Like, if you think this is going away at the midterms, like, because he'll still be the president. And he knows he's not going to be removed through impeachment, right? Things could get better. Someone asked him to cancel the midterms. And I thought about that one, and I'm going to present you with what I think is good news. I think there's like an 80% chance that we will have the midterm elections on schedule. And I think there's a 65 to 70% chance that the midterm elections we will have on schedule will be basically free and fair. Right? So, I mean, I'm calling that optimism. And the midterms could matter. Like, if the Democrats win big, if Republicans feel heat, if there are fewer people who are willing to support, if they start to smell blood in the water, and people who want to be in the system after Trump is gone start to think, instead of as they've thought for the last 10 years, I have to stay close to this guy, I need to distance myself from this guy, right? That could help if that happens. Right now, Congress isn't going to do anything, right? It doesn't want to. And the people who want to are scared. Who could do something? The blue state governors. There's a limit to what they can do, but there are things they can do, and some of them are trying. Some of them are experimenting with saying to the federal government, if you cut off our funding, we're not going to send you the FICA taxes. That's billions of dollars, right? It's some sort of counterweight. Trump imposed tariffs on Canada. Ontario said we're cutting off the power, right? Governor Walz in Minnesota calls Ontario and says, forget Washington, D.C. Can we talk just for Minnesota, right? There are various things like that blue state governors can do and will do if they are pushed to do so and encouraged, and if they hang together and believe that people will have their backs, right? That's important. And the having their backs thing is really important, right? Because like the really important thing is not to buckle under the threat, right? If Columbia buckles, NYU buckles. NYU buckles, Yale buckles. Yale, like everybody. If Covington and Berlin buckles and Perkins Coie buckles, then that's why someone has to be Williams and Conley and say, no, like here we're going to try to hold a line, right? And this, like a number who asked the question, one from another, how does democracy survive this? One answer is people have to do what Williams and Conley did. They have to stand up and say, we're drawing a line here. We're not temporizing. We're not waiting. Because a bully to whom you give your lunch money today will take your lunch money tomorrow, right? And because there's no avoiding it. Like, there's no safe place. Like, I can just sit it out and, you know, like, you can face it today or you can face it later, right? Or you could just give up. So you gotta face it today. I was asked if I could change one element of the Constitution to strengthen democracy, what I would do. In ordinary times, I would say we have to reapportion the Senate, which is a ticking time bomb at the heart of American constitutional legitimacy. But we are like several steps, like we are in much more of an emergency condition than that to be the answer. Right now, and interpreting the question to be not really how does democracy survive, but how does the rule of law and constitutional democracy survive, if I could do one thing, I would insulate control of the enforcement authorities from the president, right? The Watergate thing. And say, he can't just order investigations and prosecutions of whoever he wants, because that is a super dangerous tool that he will be willing to use. If we get past Trump, I might say we need radical change to our election systems. Our election systems have been reformed over the past half century in war through the very well-intentioned idea of democratizing them through primary elections and so on and so on and so forth. What it's done is radicalize and polarize the parties, right? Something like that, maybe. Better still than any of that, though, but would be to fix not the constitutional system, but the information system, right? There are things I like and don't like about the US Constitution. Right now, it isn't the major problem. The major problem is the information environment, right? But that wasn't within the parameters of the question, and it's also not within my specialty to talk about. Though, because I was asked, I did distribute a list of sources of information that I think are good, reliable, smart sources of information about this sort of stuff, and also some organizations that do good work here that are trustworthy, both as information as people whose work to support. There's also a thing, I see Rob Mickey in the back. There's also a thing now starting at the university, a series of talks and seminars called Resistance and Reality Checks, where people will distribute reliable information about this. You can look for that on the university's website. I want to be clear. The Republic might not survive. But it might. Right? I mean, that's where we are. And that being the case, I figure we have to do what we can to make the second thing more likely. So, a number of you asked, what can we do? Someone very cleverly asked the question, because my bio says that I'm on the board of advisors of this thing called Protect Democracy. Someone asked, what would the board of Protect Democracy say is the single most important action for an individual citizen to take right now? And I have good news for you. We've written it on the website. If you go to the Protect Democracy website and click on News and Resources, and then click on How You Can Protect Democracy, you will see a list of 29 actions that normal citizens can take, right, to do that. They're not in order of importance, they're in order of like explanatory flow. The one that identifies itself as the most important is actually something you wouldn't guess it. But the one that is identified as the most important is actually clean up your contacts. Like your phone, your email, wherever you keep your contacts, clean it up. Have it be organized. Have it be current. Because it's a channel, and don't trust a social media app to do it. Right? Because it's a channel of distribution of information that it is entirely possible you will need and want to be really reliable. Now, people hear this and they think, clean up my contacts? Like, that's not going to solve this problem. And the thing is, yeah, that's right, but neither is anything else that you're going to do as an individual, right? The question is, if 100 million people do 20 things, how much does that help? And there are 29 on this list. All right, last thing and I'll wrap up. This is the stuff about Jews, right? I was asked, how do Jews plan for our own safety and think about our own responsibility in this circumstance? And I'll just say briefly, I'll do safety first and then responsibility. Safety. Anti-Semitism is a real danger. Like, I know that, like, a quarter of conservative Jews, 3/4 of Orthodox Jews who voted in the election voted for Trump. But the white nationalists know he's their guy. They know this, and they're not wrong. This is not Germany 1933, where that's history never repeats itself that way, and it's not repeating itself that way now. It's an analogy that a lot of us are conditioned to reach for. That's actually not what we're living through. Like, a better analogy, also a bad analogy, but better, is actually Russia 1999. The threat is a system that collapses into oligarchic kleptocracy. That's not a perfect example either. The threat is going to come. Stop. The threat will come in the form of anti-Semitism, at least in the beginning, much more from Trump's supporters in the public than from the administration. That's a real thing, right? It's going to happen. I mean, yes, there are a bunch of Jews in the mix in his administration, but if you'll pardon the expression, for Christ's sake, Elon Musk is giving Nazi salutes. Like, it's a serious thing. It's confusing to a bunch of people because these are the pro-Israel anti-Semites. But that's what they are, and that's why I understand the pulling of funding from the universities with the way they've done it as a way to hurt the universities and ultimately have the Jews take the blame for it. The last thing about responsibility, the question is asked, like, what is our responsibility as Jews? So here I want to say, like, Jewish opinion is diverse, and Jewish tradition is diverse, and there are relatively few questions on which I think there is one right Jewish answer. There are a lot of possible ways of thinking about Jewish responsibility here that go in lots of different directions. And all I can do is tell you mine, that is to say the way I think about it. And you will think about it however you think is most persuasive to you. Setting aside my parents, who have been wonderful parents, the most important influence on my development as a human being was my grandfather, my Saba, who was born in Poland in 1916 and lost everyone in the Holocaust and survived more than a year in Auschwitz and came to America after the war and built a new thriving family and was just the most amazing person. Like, I could talk about him for hours. And he and my parents taught me to be a Jew in a certain set of ways, right? When I became an activist in 2017, and people asked me, why are you doing this now? I gave what I thought was just like, it was just my honest answer. I wasn't trying to be metaphorical. I said, my Saba died a dozen years ago. And the next time I see him, he's going to ask me what I did. And I need a good answer, right? Because if I am the kind of Jew that my Saba and my parents raised me to be, I know three things. The first is that we are commanded to love the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. The second is, when the world looks like a narrow bridge, the important thing is not to be afraid. And the third is, it is not my responsibility individually to finish the work, but I am not free to sit it out. And there I stop.
I want to say thank you so much. That was incredible. I do have a few more questions, and there are a couple of questions that came through on the registration that I wasn't able to get to you in time. So I'm going to ask those questions, and I'm going to ask you to hold those for just a second. Okay. One question. How can public education be improved to protect modern democracy?
I am the wrong person to answer this question. It cannot be improved in time to meet the present crisis. It's a long-term goal. I have noticed that the present generation, I love my students year after year, and people born after 1990, I'm speaking in horrible generalizations, don't know anything about history. It's a topic, I think the post-war generation was living so close to what I will describe as historical time that it was in the water. And then that generation assumed that it would be in the water for the next generation, and that's not how it works. But I'm the wrong person for this question. It's not my part of the shop, and I don't like pretending to kinds of expertise that I don't have.
Understood. So these two questions feel related to me, but I am not the expert in the room. If POTUS ignores the courts and violates the Constitution, would it be legal for the military to relieve him of his functions and enforce the law? Second question that I feel may be related. In today's news, there was a story about ICE detention of a Palestinian green card holder for what appeared to be free speech. How can that not be a violation of the Constitution?
Good. I like these questions because they have easy answers. Number one, no, it would not be legal for the military to remove him from office. It would not be. That's easy. And here's the thing that I understand why you get to extremists and people start fantasizing about military coups. That's why military coups happen in lots of countries around the world, right? And if you think it can't happen here, you've not been paying attention. Things that you think can't happen here can happen here, right? I'm not betting on it, but here's the one thing that I want to say about like the Deus Machina the mechanism of like the salvation of the military coup. There are two kinds of countries. Countries that have never had a military coup, and countries that have had a bunch of them. It's really hard to have just one, right? So that's what I'll say about the military. The second question, how can it not be a violation of the First Amendment to deport someone for political ideas expressed? The answer is, it's totally a violation of the First Amendment. It's just that the fact that it's a violation of the First Amendment is, in the view of the administration, not a reason not to do it. Right? Like, I'm going to do it and dare you to stop me.
Okay. Again, these two feel somewhat related to me, so I'll ask them together. Suppose that we manage to survive 2 years of Trump and a majority of the voters realize that they've been had, i.e., the administration has no interest in their welfare. So they vote for a presumably Democratic House. Will we be able to reverse the damage he has done, or will USA cease to be a world power, changing the course of history, I think? What country benefits? China. Second question that I feel is related, again, not the expert. Why have his enablers chosen to enable him rather than stop him?
Okay, I actually think they're two different questions.
Okay.
The first question. The damage can be repaired because forever is a long time. But the damage will not be repaired quickly. It's much easier to break things than it is to build them. The damage that will be done in the next couple of years will not be repaired, even if the Democrats win significant majorities in the next 3 elections, right? The midterms, the presidency, the next midterms, the damage will not yet be repaired. It's going to take longer than that, right? And the damage will not be repaired until repairing the damage doesn't depend on electing Democrats. right? The country needs a strong Republican Party, right? It doesn't have to be called the Republican Party. Right? The country needs a strong, like, two-party system. One party that has a mode a little to the left of the center, and one party that has a mode a little to the right of the center, where both parties are responsible actors in the playground basketball game, right? So as long as one of the parties isn't, it almost doesn't matter, right? And like you won't get, you can fix things, you can stick fingers in the dike, you won't have restored stability, right? The other thing, I mean, like, I know I talked for a long time, but I did not present anything like a comprehensive catalog of my first degree worries about President Trump. Like, there are many other things. And the geopolitics thing is one of them, right? I think it's probably, like, really bad and irreversible. That is to say, like, the world in which the United States was the leader of the free world, like, you should feel the ebb tide of the water rushing past your feet.
Yeah.
Like, we will be out of the Five Eyes intelligence gathering, because, like, if I were Australia, I would not want to be sharing intelligence with this administration, right? I don't know, we all know who will benefit. China, Russia, Iran, like a bunch of other, right? Ronald Reagan is somersaulting in his grave, right? And that doesn't get fixed. I mean, it's just like the United States was a dominant world power for plus or minus 80 years. Like, that's as long as the Portuguese, maybe, right? Nothing lasts forever. It turns out there was no other country in the world that was able successfully to displace us from that role. We did it to ourselves. And I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, because I have generally thought that as imperfect as the United States is, the projection of American power and influence around the world is on net a good thing. And I'm really upset that it has been so squandered, but I believe it has been squandered, and I don't think that that bell can be unrung in the foreseeable future. I hope the Europeans step up, right? I mean, I haven't quite gotten to the point of thinking maybe the Germans will save us. But I hope they will, right? At least for the other thing, why have his enablers not stopped him? Well, yeah. This is one of the things that, like, even if there's a recovery, and, like, I hope there will be a recovery, right? Even if there's a recovery, there are some things that will never go back, and some of them are inside my brain. And one of the things that I will never forgive this episode of history for is what it has taught me about human nature, right? Sometimes I think of my adulthood as a series of discoveries of my remaining naivete, right? Like, I thought I'd seen it all, and now I'm fully realistic and cynical and so forth. Nope, it turns out it can get worse, right? Some people support Trump because they don't have information. Some people support Trump because they like what he does. They like it, right? They are affirmatively attracted to it. And some people support Trump because they have concrete interests in what he does. Like, they know that he's terrible, but they would like to pay less in taxes, right? Or they know that he's terrible, but they have something else particular to gain or to protect. And some people support Trump because they're cowards. And this is the thing, like, when one of the things that I will never forget is the cowardice of people who did know better and went along. But if we don't know that that's part of human nature, who does? Right? I mean, that's the game. And the enormously disillusioning thing is to realize that that remains the game.
Okay, before I get to the next question, I'm going to make an announcement before I forget. This is Rob Mickey, also a member here at Beth Israel, if you're unfamiliar. There is a series of teach-ins at the University of Michigan, and he has offered to send me the information, and I can get it out to you. Here is your assignment. If you would like the information about the next 2 teach-ins, which are happening next week and the 2 weeks after, please email me. I'm Barbara McAnally. I'm the Director of Engagement and Programming. You'll find my information literally all over our website. Please email me, and I will share Rob's information with you. If you'd like to speak with him afterwards, please do that as well. But he wanted to make sure that everybody here has the information. Richard has also spoken at these teach-ins. I think there's a couple other members that are involved, I feel like I've heard. So please email me, and I will get the information to you as well. We have a couple more questions. Here we go. All right. The DOJ has a policy that you can't indict a sitting president. If Trump defies a Supreme Court ruling, does the Supreme Court have the power to hold him in civil contempt that involves incarceration until he complies, or would the court be limited to fining him until he complies? I'm excited about this one.
Neither of those things is going to happen. It is possible to imagine some subordinate official in the administration being held in civil contempt. That is not, what did I say a moment ago? My adulthood is a series of discoveries of my remaining naivete. So there have been things before that I said are not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
Understood? Okay. Let me make sure I'm starting from the right side. Okay, I am not. Here we are.
I'm going to say one thing about it.
Yes.
The question is a form of the disease of thinking that the courts are an institution that can fix it. They're not. They can slow it down. They cannot fix it.
So nothing can fix it?
No. A mobilized populace can fix it. Right? Like an economic meltdown that, can mobilize a populace that fixes things. Really horrible things. Poland went bad post Cold War, and then they found their way again, right? But that's not going to fix it.
Okay. Are Article 3 judiciary employees in danger of Doge firings?
No. Well, the judges are not, and I don't think the personnel are either, because the administration doesn't want to tick off the courts. Right? The question is, a bully preys on weak people. Right? A bully goes after people who don't have the capacity to strike back. Right? The courts can't solve the problem, but they can make trouble. Right? The administration goes after, doesn't have an incentive to go after them. So I think the answer to that is no.
Okay. We have 2 more questions. If you have a question, please get it to Jenny quickly. At this point, we're on the last 2 questions. Okay? Anybody? Okay. All right. 19 states through, why do I need the light? 19 states through legislation have submitted applications for a constitutional convention under Article 2.
5.
Excuse me. Look at that. Article 5. Look at that. Only 11 more are needed. How threatening do you think this is as a possibility? And are you active in opposing this? Have you considered the need to become active?
I used to be active in it, so I should say a sentence or two of background. Right? The U.S. Constitution can be amended formally in 2 different ways. One is with the vote of 2/3 of each House of Congress, and then ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's the way the Constitution has been amended every time the Constitution has been amended. There is another path that has never been taken, according to which a supermajority of legislatures can call a convention. And that convention, rather than Congress, can then propose amendments. And then those amendments take effect if ratified by the 3/4 of the legislatures. It's never been done. In our century, there's a group of people have had the dream and project of making it happen, and they have an agenda of the kind of amendments they would like to pass. And they're mostly not amendments that I would like to see passed. And so I used to be opposed to this. Then I stopped being opposed to it. For a combination of two reasons that are in tension with each other, but either one is good enough. The first is, I'm not really persuaded, because the idea is, if you got a convention, you could change a lot, right? Like a whole bunch of them, and the people who want to do it imagine that they're going to get a convention that is aligned with them ideologically, and they'll rewrite the whole Constitution, right? The thing is, if there were any kind of reasonable process for deciding who sits at that convention, the convention couldn't agree on anything, the rest of us can't agree on anything. That convention will neither have a supermajority in favor of codifying a right to abortion, nor a supermajority in favor of prohibiting abortion, right? Most of what we'll be able to agree on will be what we have already. So I'm not sure, right? And if that's not true, if it is possible that such a convention could make significant reforms, I used to be against it because I thought we were doing pretty well. Now, given the option, I would say, give it a shot. Probably nothing happens, but the chances of something good coming out of it are not worse than the chances of recovery through the ordinary channels.
Okay. Here we are. This is no longer the final question. What is his end goal other than power and money? What is his vision? Is he intent on destroying the country?
Is he Trump?
Yes.
Oh, I mean...
It's not capitalized, so I believe yes, it is Trump.
Yeah, okay. Look, I think this question really calls for a kind of training and expertise that is different from mine. This is a question about the psychology of an individual, right? And there are people much more expert than I am to deal with that, right? If I were guessing, I think he's a solipsistic narcissist, right? I think, you asked, what is his motivation other than power and money? Well, other than power, money, fame, look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, I can do whatever I want all the time. I think that suffices to explain a great deal, right? Maybe there are people who understand better than I do, who would see other things. It's just super disorienting for us to imagine such a person in the presidency because we've never had it before. Let me be clear, you need a healthy, strong ego to become president, right? Presidents tend to be people who think relatively highly of themselves, right? But every previous president we have had has believed that there are things more important than himself, right? Every previous president, has had some vision for what America they wanted to leave behind after them, and for what they wanted their political party to look like after them, and for these various other things, right? Every one of them. I don't think he does particularly. I mean, I think he has attitudes. I think he has attitudes about what kind of people he likes and what kind of people he doesn't, and so who he would like to benefit and who he would like to harm. But I don't think that really adds up to an angle. I just think that's a bunch of dispositions. That's my best attempt at understanding.
Okay, so I'm holding the final two questions. Yes, I'm holding the final two questions. Okay. All right. The question, and I'm going to add my own editorializing here on inflection. So there are no checks on presidential power?
See, that's not what I said. It's not, right? Sometimes when my students come in on the first day of a class in constitutional law, and they think there are two ways of interpreting the Constitution. One is you do strictly what it says in the text of the document, and the other is anything goes, right? And I know people who think that way about Jewish law too, right? But you see, that's wrong. That's a false dichotomy, right? Often what happens is you get students who come in believing that the right way to do constitutional interpretation is the law of the Constitution is exactly what I get from a direct literal reading of the document. They think that's what it means to do law. They figure out over the course of the first half of the semester that it doesn't work, right? That won't actually get them the system, right? And they experience existential despair, right? And that drives them to think, so what you're saying is anything goes, right? But see, that's not the alternative. There are like 17 different things in between those two poles, and all of real life happens in one of those 17 stages in between, right? So if I say the president has a bad man attitude toward the law, which he does, and the courts aren't going to fix it, which they're not, and the Senate isn't going to remove him, which they're not, if you have in your mind a sort of like rosy civics book picture of how American government works, and you think that the normal checks and balances are adequate to solve the problem, and I told you those things aren't adequate to solve the problem, you're going to go to the nihilistic existential despair space and think that what I've told you is that there are no checks. But that's not right. There are 17 things in between, right? There are some things that would be really hard to do without legislation, and there's still a filibuster in the Senate, right? And that's hard to do. There are some things that are hard to do because even the President of the United States with the full administrative state at his control cannot do magic, right? And there are lots of things that are just like actually like physically, practically difficult to accomplish. He cannot deport all the people he wants to deport. We don't have the logistics for it, right? There will be lawyers and politicians and journalists, right, and like local civic groups that try to slow him down, right? If you've ever been the chief in some hierarchical organization where everyone answers to you, you know that it's not true that there are no checks on you, right? You've had the frustrating experience of not being able to get done everything you want to get done. Even when the rules are, you get to make all the calls, right? He needs enablers. And every needed enabler is also a potential check, right? And there are civil society institutions that can drive conversation, that can make the enablers more likely to be checks, right? The forces of the national economy, right, are a potential check. There are lots of checks. What I'm saying is, the ones that we were taught in civics are the ones that are going to do it, aren't, right? And second, I cannot promise you that there is some other set of checks that will do the job to your satisfaction. I cannot promise you that. But I can tell you that that doesn't mean that it's fait accompli that they won't, right? What I can tell you is we live in a moment of profound risk and uncertainty, right? With like, the variables are kaleidoscopic, but that is different from saying there are no checks.
Yes,
Okay. Final question for the evening.
Yeah.
And I want to say thank you so much, Richard. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to call this my own personal hope question. Are we ready?
Give it to me.
Okay. How many votes are there on SCOTUS to allow for a third term?
Oh. This is a great question to end on. I'm going to say something as a point of like old man's privilege about this, and then I'll answer the question directly. People, many professional lawyers in my generation and older, like the locution SCOTUS, which is the acronym for Supreme Court of the United States, is like nails on a chalkboard. like kids today with their acronyms and it's the Supreme Court. You can just call it the Supreme Court, right? I tell my students it's fine with me if you want to call it SCOTUS when you talk to each other. You should know that if you walk into court and say SCOTUS, the judge will hear it like nails on a chalkboard, and you never want to make a judge hear nails on a chalkboard. The question was, how many votes are there on the Supreme Court to permit a third term? And the answer is 0.
That's right. Okay.
Because there isn't one of them, because, and this is really important when you think about the judicial check. Not when you think about the capacity of the institution, but when you think about, which is limited, when you think about the psychology of the decision maker, right? What I'm about to say isn't true of all judges, but it is in my experience true of most judges in our system, even the ones who I think are deeply wrong-headed about a lot of important things. It is an important part of their self-conception that they are neutral arbiters of the rule of law. That's what makes them feel special. Right? If we like give them black robes and suck up to them and call them your honor, so that they will feel special. Right? What makes them feel special is their self-conception of neutral arbiters of the rule of law. Because people are very good at motivated reasoning, that is, because people are very good at thinking that an argument for an outcome they like is actually better than it is still the case that judges who think of themselves as neutral arbiters of the rule of law will predictably make different decisions in cases where the law is unclear on the basis of their ideologies and worldviews and intuitions, which is why we care who sits as a judge, right? But most cases that go into court have right answers.